Hey, on this week's episode of 90 Degrees, we talk about finding value betting on extreme outcomes. We teach you how to build a successful betting model and our pari-mutuel markets, the future of sports betting. That and more on today's episode of the 90 Degrees podcast. Welcome to the 90 Degrees podcast. I'm your host, G Stack George, and I'm excited because today I've got a guest who I look up to, the way he thinks about sports betting, the debates he engages in on Twitter. Some might it might feel like a royal rumble to some who are watching from the outside, but I'm glad to have him. His name is Plus EV Analytics, actuary, gambler, instructor of the art of sports betting analytics. Plus EV, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you, what was your first introduction to sports betting? It doesn't even have to be the first time you made a bet. It's when you learned that sports betting was actually a thing.
Oh boy, that would have to go back to like reading the sports section of the newspaper in my childhood, and they would publish the odds. And I remember seeing like minus 180 and PK and plus 140, and having no idea what that meant. But started this desire to learn more about this. And as I've always been into sports. The best day of my childhood was Game 6 of the '93 World Series. I'm from Toronto, just like you, George, and
Yeah.
my dad actually took me to the game. I was in the 500 level for the Joe Carter home run, which was awesome. And yeah, when I always been into sports, always been into math. When I first started to learn probability in school, I was like, yeah, this is something that really, really fascinates me. So, love of sports, love of math, love of gambling, this whole idea of you're sort of throwing your money in and you don't know what's going to happen and you're winning and you're losing, and just the exhilaration of it all that comes with all the uncertainty of not knowing whether you're going to win or lose. And that's always been kind of a part of what I'm all about. Never really thought a lot about sports betting until about 2010 or so. I did play a lot of poker, a lot of online poker, a lot of live poker, not high stakes, but sit and go tournaments on Poker Stars, things like that during the height of the poker boom. But eventually that kind of went away. The games dried up, games got tougher, and I didn't have 6 hours a day to sit around playing online poker anymore. And that's when I started thinking more seriously about sports betting. And I think I've told the story on a couple other pods, so apologies to your listeners who have heard it before. But my first sort of inkling that this could be plus EV was when I'm playing these lottery, Ontario lottery, parlays for $10, $20 a pop just for fun. And I had parlayed a hockey team to win the game with one of the players on that team to outscore one of the players on the other team. And I was into it enough to understand what a correlated parlay is and why that would be good. I didn't think that would be enough to beat the 39% hold that was built into this parlay product. But when I went to the store to hand the cashier my slip, he ran it through his machine, and the bet got rejected. The Ontario Lottery Corporation would not take my action on, I think it was a $10 parlay. And the reason was that the system had already exceeded their maximum liability for that specific combination. So driving home, thinking to myself about what could possibly have happened to cause that, the only conclusion I could come up with was that enough smart people out there were playing the same ticket that I had tried to play. And the only reason they would do that is if it is an advantage situation. So got home, started working on my first sports betting analytics model that day. And I had a good run of it for a few years.
Beautiful. I want to catch up the listeners. For those who don't know, OLG is like the Ontario Lottery Gaming Corporation. They offered sports betting. They offered certain events where you had to bet all the point spreads, minimum two up to maximum. I think it was 10 of them or 12 of them. And they would give you less odds that you would get in a sports book, but there was some built in advantages. the lines were stale. Once they put up the lines, they only adjusted them once on the Friday. So you can imagine come Sunday how many lines were no longer applicable. The other thing was they had other options where you can bet. It was called Pro Line, where you can bet some events and outcomes, and a lot of people found advantages through correlated outcomes. So you could still overcome a high built-in vig, and plus EV's not the only one who had thought of this. There's a lot of people who have been beating the old G market for a while until they started to adjust and close some of those gaps. I wanted to talk about, you said you figured out a lot of smart bettors are doing this, and it kind of satiated you to go out and build some models and figure things out. Uh, Outside of the money, is that what rewards you? Is the gamesmanship of I can beat this, finding the correct strategy?
Oh, 100%. Now, the money is great. I'm not going to lie about that. But beyond that, it's an intellectual challenge. And it's one that I sometimes don't get in other aspects of my life. So many people know I'm not a professional bettor. I have a day job, which I love as well. But I find that there is a more direct link between ability and success in gambling than in business. Despite all the randomness, anybody could have a good day or a bad day, or a good year or a bad year. But the great thing about success in gambling is it's not about people's perception of you. Well, your boss likes you, so you get a raise or you get a promotion or whatever. You are in control of your own success or failure. It's not about looking good; it's about being good. And yeah, anybody could win or lose any given day, week, month, or year. But long term success is really about how smart you are, how much work you put in, the connections you make, how much you can learn. It's entirely about your own abilities.
Now, you say you're in your day job, you're an actuary by trade. Is there a skills overlap between that and sports betting?
Oh, 100% there is. And especially the type of work I do, which is pricing for insurance. It's kind of analogous to being an odds maker. Um, People ask me, okay, you're an actuary, that must make you a good gambler. And that is somewhat true. There are a lot of skills and techniques that I've learned throughout my education and my experience that have helped me. But what I would say is even more true is that being a gambler has made me a good actuary, because I deal with concepts like risk, expected value, variance. To me, they're not just concepts in a textbook or on a spreadsheet. There's something real that I interact with every day outside of work, and get to know intimately. And that really helps me apply a lot of the concepts that have been kind of inspired by my gambling career in my real career.
One of the things that I apply to like a lot of aspects of life, not just gambling, whenever somebody presents me with a dilemma, because I'm a very good advice guy, someone to sound off on when you've got a tricky situation. I always break down with people what's the upside, what's the downside, and walk through all the different examples, and then if the upside is worth the potential downside. And a lot of that, it's like a simplistic way of saying, expected value, which is something that you have in your name. How do you apply math into your sports betting? Say you see a line that you believe is mispriced. How are you checking that with math for those that don't know?
So before we get into that, what you said is actually very, very valuable about looking at your upside and looking at your downside. And in a way, it's actually superior to expected value, probabilistic kind of thinking, because in a lot of this, it's hard to put exact probabilities on things that might happen in the future. My favorite author, a guy named Nassim Taleb, has a book called Anti-Fragile. It talks all about, okay, well, the best way to manage risk is not to try to predict the future. It's to put yourself in a position where you have more upside from unknown surprises than you have downside. So, I mean, what you're saying really reminded me of that, and it's a great strategy. Um,
I just to interject 1 second. There was that there was a famous instance a couple months ago where Steve Fezzik, and for those who don't know, is a professional sports bettor. He also sells picks. He ended up losing a lot of money laying minus 6,600 with Purdue, and there was a whole discussion about if it's plus EV, it's still a good bet. And I was talking with Johnny from BetStamp about this on my podcast, and I said the one thing that I don't think we discuss enough is the risk of ruin when we're discussing positive EV examples. You're risking 66 units to win one essentially by laying that bet. And some people say, well, maybe he wasn't trying to win a unit and he didn't risk 66% of his bankroll to do so. Then I say, then what's the point of trying to capture even a quarter of a unit and risking even 20% of your bankroll? It's just the risk of ruin. I don't care that that situation is plus EV. There's certain situations I'm not willing to do, like blow my whole bankroll on one plus EV play. And I think that when we talk about weighing downside versus upside, the upside wasn't great enough for me to risk all that downside in that situation.
Yeah, in general, I agree with you. I think in Fezzik's case, him having been around for as many decades as he's been around, I think his percentage of his bankroll that he was risking on that one play was probably insignificant in terms of risk of ruin. So I think that's a good general principle that you never want to put yourself, at a substantial risk of ruin. Probably wasn't a huge consideration for this bet on this day. I know people like to say, never lay more than, minus 400, or never lay more than 1,000, minus 1,000, anything like that. I don't personally subscribe to that philosophy.
Neither do I. It just the okay, if it wasn't, a large piece of his bankroll, so what was he trying to scoop up, like breadcrumbs, a tenth of a unit? It to me, again, it doesn't. When you get to a certain price that's large enough, even if you're not risking your whole bankroll to win one unit, you're risking a percentage of your bankroll to basically collect nothing, something insignificant to your bankroll. I get it's a plus EV situation, but there's a lot of plus EV bets you can make, and you don't have to make every single one because because to me, you still have to factor that downside. And I don't believe in that hard line of minus 400. I won't bet anything higher. But at minus 6,600, I get to that point where it becomes uncomfortable.
Yeah, I didn't wake up this morning thinking I'd be here defending Steve Fezzik this evening, but here we are, and I think that the one thing that we also have to keep in mind is that the favorite long shot bias is real in a lot of different sports and a lot of different markets, and so when something is priced at minus 1,000, minus 2,000, minus 6,600, it's at least possible that the favorite long shot bias is so extreme on this because a lot of people think like you. They don't want to lay minus 6,600 ever on anything. So for the book, that they're going to, for the market, they're going to set their pricing such that it's going to be quite unfavorable on the other side, which people will find more attractive. People like to lay a little to win a lot, whether that's minus 10% EV or minus 40% EV. So oftentimes you will find, I don't know about this specific example because I don't have a model that would give me a number on this game, but just in general, you can very easily pick up the best of it on a lot of these things by laying a big price in general. I have no opinion on that specific bet and whether it was good or bad, but it's at least possible that this thing had a 99% chance of winning, or whatever it is. I think what the kind of counter argument on that is there's so many unknowns in a sporting event that even if you think, who was it, Purdue? I forget the team. You think they're 99% to win. You could very easily be wrong, and you don't have to be wrong by much to turn a plus EV bet into a minus EV bet when you're dealing with that level of juice. So those are the arguments kind of on both sides that I would put forward on that example.
All right. Before I interrupted you, we were going to talk about applying math to sports betting.
Yeah, and applying math to sports betting, in a way, it's simple. You look at all the possible outcomes. You assign a probability to each. Probability times your payout equals your expected value. And if it's positive, bet it, and if it's negative, don't. I realize it's probably an oversimplification compared to where you're trying to go with this. But I think the real tough part is, well, how do you know what the probability is on any given event? The cool thing about sports, unlike pretty much any other gambling proposition out there, is you are not dealing with a controlled universe of known probabilities like you are at a blackjack table or a craps table or flipping coins or whatever. You are always estimating probabilities. And that is a whole different world than operating in known probabilities. Because now you have to deal with, well, what if my estimate is wrong? When I flip a coin, I know the chance of getting heads is 50%. It would take, I know there are biased coins out there, but it would take a lot of data to convince me that any given coin is not 50-50. But when you're dealing with the probability of team A beating team B, you're not in the world where the laws of physics naturally dictate probabilities. You have to figure it out on your own. That's what makes sports betting so much fun.
So, how confident are you in the numbers that you put out? Do you ever question your math? Are you a hardcore, this is the math? And how do you apply a subjective lens, being someone who looks at sports betting through a numbers perspective and a math based perspective?
I don't question the math because math is math. But what you can and should always question is anytime you're building a mathematical model contains data and assumptions. And assumptions are always the tricky part. And what everyone should do when they're building a model is step back and think about what assumptions are either explicit or implicit in the model they're building. And sometimes the assumptions are something as simple as the game today will sort of be similar to the game that was played last year or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And sometimes that's not even true. The way the game itself is played changes over time. You look at basketball, and the number of 3-point attempts
Yeah.
goes up pretty much every year, year over year. So any model that you're building based on historical data implicitly assumes that, okay, the game is going to get played in 2023 like it was in whatever time period that you're using. And a lot of times you just don't even think about that as an assumption you're making. You're just, okay, well, I'm taking my data and I'm throwing it in a model because that's what people do. And I think that is where people can get tripped up. Not that the math is the math. The math is not wrong. It's the application of it. It's the okay, well, I'm going to build my model based on data from 2018 to 2022 and use it in 2023. That only works if what happened between 2018 and 22 is related in a very predictable way to what's going to happen, the distribution of possible outcomes in 2023.
Hey, before we get back to the show, I want to talk about our sponsor, Pinnacle. Pinnacle is the world's sharpest sports book and available to bettors in Ontario. Find out what professional bettors have known for decades. Pinnacle is where the best bettors play. Must be 19 plus in Ontario. Please play responsibly. Not available in the US. Now back to the show. Let's put a pin in it because I want to get back to it and I really want to show people a breakdown on how to build a model. You said something about when we were discussing Purdue and how it's generally known that the general recreational bettor loves a longer shot and loves the big odds, and because of it, oftentimes you find yourself with great prices. Like the Super Bowl is the big example of will there be a safety? Yes, no, and laying big juice is actually very plus EV. But the thing is, you've done well betting extreme outcome measures in futures markets with big prices. Tell us a little on how you're finding an edge doing that.
Sure. So I think the best way to illustrate that would be if we start with an example. Say you're flipping a coin. Say you're going to simulate the outcome of an average team over a 17 game NFL season by flipping a coin 17 times and counting how many heads you get. And that's the number of wins you're sort of simulating. So let's price two different kinds of bets using this coin flip. One is a standard line, so 8.5 wins. Probability of less than 8.5 wins flipping coins is going to be exactly 50%. And then let's look at what our alt market might be. So what's the probability of under 5.5 heads flipping 17 coins? This is your standard textbook binomial distribution problem they teach you in high school probability, and you can calculate the probability of about 7% of under 5.5 heads. Fair odds for that alt market would be about plus 1294 on the under 5.5 heads in 17 coin flips. Okay, cool. Now let's switch it up a little bit. The Denver Broncos, the market win total on them as we record this in late June is 8.5. So the market expects them to be a league average team. I have no reason to disagree with the market on that. So let's go with that. Broncos win total is 8.5. The only difference between the Broncos and the coin is we know the coin is 50-50. We think the Broncos are 50-50, but we could be wrong. So let's suppose that the Broncos might be an 8.5 win team. They might be a 6.5 win team. They might be a 10.5 win team with equal likelihood of all three of those events. And we're going to price those same two markets again. So your standard market under 8.5 is still 50%. So we have not lost that consistency with the market number by switching from we know the Broncos are an 8.5 win team to they might be 6.5, 8.5, or 10.5. Either way, the true number on under 8.5 is even 50%. So we haven't lost that anchoring to the market number. Now let's price our alt under 5.5 with this extra uncertainty added that we don't know whether the Broncos are 6.5, 8.5, or 10.5 win team. And if you do that, your probability under 5.5 is now 13%, not 7 like it was with the coin flip. Fair odds are now plus 662 instead of plus 1294. So what's the difference between the Broncos and the coin? It's that we've introduced something called parameter uncertainty in some places. It's called epistemic uncertainty in some places. I like to call it the hidden generator. So there is this hidden thing called how good are the Broncos? And we have an estimate for what that is, but we don't know what that is for sure. And that adds extra variance to this distribution, especially as you get toward the tails or the more extreme outcomes. It doesn't do much. Adding this extra dose of uncertainty doesn't do much when you're working in the middle of distribution, but it does a lot when you're working in the outside. So what I've been able to do over the years is do pretty well betting plus money. So this is the opposite of the other example with favorite long shot bias. This is books not properly pricing in this extra layer of uncertainty in the distribution, and it has led to some extremely plus EV spots on whether it's alternate lines where the total is 8.5, but you're taking under 6.5 or over 10.5, or whether it's even exact number of wins. So I did pretty well. I think it was on the Rams last year where their market number was like 8.5 or 9 or something. And so I think I bet them to win exactly 2, exactly 3, exactly 4. I forget how many they actually won, but one of those actually hit at a I think it was 200 to 1 or 300 to 1 or something. So it was a good it was a good outcome because the odds for each of those exact win totals were priced more in line with the coin flip. So the chances of two heads. How many games did the Rams win? 2, 3,
5, I believe.
5. Okay, so the chances of 5 heads out of 17 flips are not the same as the chance of an 8.5 win team winning 5 games. There is so much more likelihood that the 8.5 team will win 5 games because, hey, the Rams might be worse than we thought. The Rams might be better than we thought. Where the coin flip, you know exactly what you're dealing with.
Got it. Now, this can apply to a lot of different teams. Is this where a subjective layer comes in and you say, okay, here's the 8 teams that I believe their upside or downside is not being captured properly? Like I call them rigid teams versus teams with wide range of outcomes. we all know who the Kansas City Chiefs are, and it's going to be very hard to capture extreme outcomes with them. Whereas a team like Baltimore with a new offensive coordinator, Cleveland with an unknown quarterback, Pittsburgh with an unknown quarterback, a lot of these teams they have a lot wider range of outcomes. So when you're gathering which teams to look at and see the prices on, how do you gather them?
So you're absolutely right that the width of that distribution, the magnitude of that parameter uncertainty is going to differ from team to team. I haven't yet come up with a way to quantify that accurately. I've tried a couple things, and maybe I'll try again this year. One thing I did find last year, and this is not about the width of the distribution, more about the position of it, that the win total markets seem to be off in systematic ways when you have things like, for example, a second year quarterback. The market tends to underestimate the leap that a team would make
Yeah.
when they have a second year quarterback at the helm. And I found going back, I think I went back about 6 or 7 years, there was a significant kind of miscalibration where teams with second year quarterback would hit the over much more than the under to a significant degree.
Yeah.
Something else around if you have either a new head coach and a returning offensive coordinator, or a returning head coach and a new offensive coordinator, that's something that the market overvalued. It was a negative impact that the market didn't really pick up. Stuff like that, and it's you can find the article from last year on my site, pluscbanalytics.com. But you're right, and that's something that I think about intuitively, but I haven't been able to build into the model yet. That the idea that the magnitude of the uncertainty is different between different teams, and one of the ways that manifests is in how big is the drop off between your starting quarterback and your backup quarterback, because one unexpected thing that could happen is your quarterback could get injured, and that could screw up your whole season for a team. And my friend Andy of the Deep Dive podcast coined the term clipboard delta, which I love, as the magnitude of the drop off between your starter and your backup. So obviously for KC it would be huge. For a team with a more average or below average starter and maybe a good backup, that drop off might not be so big. So that if the quarterback gets injured, you really haven't changed the distribution much. Where obviously if Mahomes or Josh Allen gets injured, you've just taken, I don't know, 4 or 5 wins away from the full season expectation of that team.
Yeah, it's also 2 points to that is I remember when Lamar Jackson went down, and a lot of people they only accounted like 3 point gap between him and Tyler Huntley, because Huntley showed a little bit of flashes in a small sample size. And to me, like, there's certain quarterbacks that they are the entire offense. It's not just what he does when he's running the ball himself or throwing. It's all the running backs on that team average 5.5 yards per carry because the defense has to account for him, Lamar Jackson himself. So it's to what level do they raise everybody around them up? And the other part about, you talked about second year quarterbacks taking leaps. Like, some of the most recent memories is the Mahomes doesn't start his rookie year. Second year takes them to the AFC Championship game. And Lamar with the MVP season 14-2, and Jalen Hurts last year, or Joe Burrow the year they went to the Super Bowl. That those are some of the cases, and people don't realize is that second year, even third year quarterback, if they redshirted a year, sometimes those are the best, biggest edges where if you take stabs at like alt lines or futures markets, you can find yourself with tremendous value. Um, I want to talk about some stuff in the news, if you don't mind, if we can move to current events. And I'm always weary about current events because once they happen, if someone were to listen to the podcast 5 months from now, it might not be relevant. But I think there's some underlying stuff that we can discuss. There was the story about the NBA draft and Shams Charania taking a little bit of fire this past week and a half. He's, of course, the legendary NBA insider. He works for the Athletic and Stadium, but he also gets paid now by FanDuel to co-host the show. he changed the odds single-handedly on the NBA draft second overall pick market just by saying, "Hey, I'm hearing there's a lot of momentum for this player to go to this team." Now, people are questioning if it was nefarious or not. I don't believe it's nefarious, but at the very least, it opens yourself to some criticism, right?
Yeah, I think this one's been discussed a lot on Twitter, and the consensus that I agree with is that there's just there's no possible way that he would have done this with any kind of ill intent. I think his biggest mistake was actually taking money from FanDuel in the first place, because how could you not foresee something like this happening, where you make a call and maybe you're wrong and people bet it, you move the market, and people are going to say, well, he works for FanDuel, he's trying to screw us. But if you look at a guy like Shams, who has built an entire career off of breaking news, and you ask yourself, how much would you have to pay this guy to put out something that is deliberately wrong, and torpedo his own credibility for the rest of his career? Like, I don't know, 20 million, 30 million, you have to pay this guy to do that. And there's just not anywhere close to that much money, in the market. So, and I think FanDuel is doing, plenty well without having to resort to tactics like this, to squeeze a little bit of extra money. So, it's obviously ridiculous, but it's in a way his fault for setting himself up, putting himself in a position, as a trusted news source, to be affiliated with a sports book. Because even though there's no merit to this, there's perception, and that means a lot too.
Do you think he's aware of the chatter that happened following that? And do you think he'll be gun shy in the future about, predictive stuff that he doesn't have concrete goods on?
I don't think so. I think if he was, it would be a lot better for his career to just sever his relationship with FanDuel and just go back to breaking the news, because I think that's, he's either number one or number two, depending on how you feel about Woj, in the world at what he does. So if I was in the top two in the world at what I did, I would make sure I didn't do anything to jeopardize that. And so taking a paycheck, which I can't imagine how large it could possibly be, from FanDuel, that's something that I would give up before I change the way I operate.
All right. What about this? Because I think this one drove me up the wall. The Toronto mayoral race had been happening for weeks, and sports books were offering lines. And at several points, Chris Sky was the second favorite with odds as short as plus 500. And I got sent this updated, betting odds by several different people. And I just kept saying, because I bet politics, I go, this is like a nothing story. He's not even going to finish top six. He's not even going to get 2% of the vote. And I'm trying to explain to them, because when they hear me talking about preaching about market efficiency all the time, and then they see Chris Sky rockets to number two, I try to explain to them, this is the danger in reading into too much into markets that aren't liquid and the betting limits are so small. I said to them literally, I could take $500 right now if they'll book my bet, and I'll change the whole market right now. That's how irrelevant this kind of information is. Did you come across this Chris Sky short odds to become the mayor? Did you have a chuckle about it? What do you think about that?
I had actually never even heard of Chris Sky until you told me about him.
Are
I
you
don't.
not on the internet during COVID the
I
last
don't.
3 years?
No, who is he? I never heard. I don't follow politics that closely,
Oh,
especially not
he's
Toronto mayoral politics.
he's not even a politician. He's the big, muscular guy with the big neck tattoo that was screaming about masks and anti-vax.
Oh
And
boy.
yeah, like he dipped into all the conspiracies. Was on he did the Alex Jones tour. He was running for mayor in Toronto, and I guess he had a dedicated fan base who kept putting on $100 bets, firing at Bet365, and they made him the second short favorite, a guy who finished with 1% of the vote.
Okay, so hearing that from you makes the story make a lot more sense now, because now it reminds me of back in the last Trump election, that Trump was taking money like 2 weeks after the election was over, because people were so sure that the election was going to get overturned, even though there was no possible way it was going to.
Yeah.
And it was just people sort of betting their beliefs with no kind of rational thought as to value. So knowing what I know now about who this guy is, that would be my guess as to what happened here. And you're right about the market being small, not a lot of liquidity, and I think market efficiency. Well, I definitely believe in it on the whole. I think it can get overused, especially in these smaller illiquid markets,
Yeah.
where all it takes is a couple of bets to move a number. And you talked about it a little bit with Jeff Davis last week. That when you're dealing so-called information markets, or he called them no variance markets, which is an awesome term I love.
Yeah.
That whenever you're taking action, you really have to give it a lot of respect, no matter what it is or where it's coming from. So I don't blame the books for moving the way they did. But yeah, it's information markets is just a whole different world. You talked about it with Drew as well a couple of weeks ago. He's much more into that stuff than I am. But just the idea of betting on something that is not even a known outcome, but is not subject to the same randomness in the outcome that a sporting event might be,
Yeah.
it just changes the market dynamics so much.
You flagged a tweet to me from Jeff Feinberg, and it said, I get good numbers because I have, well, had so many books. I'm not a sharp. I just bet at the book with the best number. Very normal customer behavior. If I'm buying a dishwasher and get a good price at one store, will they never let me shop there again? What part of that do you want to chew the fat about?
Yeah, I am. I have a huge fascination with sportsbook economics. I tweet a lot about it. I take a lot of heat about it. I think it actually has a lot in common with insurance industry economics. Um, and going back to Feinberg's tweet, he was upset. He's saying, "Well, I'm not a sharp guy. I don't have a model. I'm just betting on the golfers I like. The only thing I'm doing that the books may not like is I'm price shopping for the best line. And how can that possibly be enough to get me kicked out of these books?" And it absolutely can be enough to get you kicked out of these books because, again, going back to your excellent interview with Jeff Davis last week, it is really really hard to be a bookmaker. You've got to put up lines on every game, every sport, every market, every day. And when you have 20, 25, 30 sports books operating independently in the market, putting up their own lines, you look at, you could even see it on BetStamp, the spread between the best line in the market on one side and the best line in the market on the other side. Well, all of a sudden you're not holding 4.5% anymore like you are with your basic minus 110. Depending on the day, the game, the market, you might be holding 0.5%, 1%, 1.5% synthetic hold, even zero or negative sometimes. And so when that happens, the market can be beaten with no knowledge of anything other than just looking at all the numbers and picking off the best one for whatever you want to bet. Like if you're odds shopping, you can bet, it doesn't, you can bet your favorite teams, you can bet only Monday Night Football overs, you can bet whatever you like. But as long as you are executing the bet you want to make by having 20 sports books open and taking the one that gives you the best number, you are never going to be paying that 4.5% vig. You're always going to be paying less, and in some cases, much less. And I think I'm a little bit unique in this take, but I see that as an existential risk for the sports betting industry because right now, we as users of odd screens, whether it's BetStamp, Unabated, Spank Odds, Don Best, they all do pretty much the same thing. Um, we are in the minority as users of those tools within the betting world. And I ask myself, well, what happens if people who use odd screens are no longer as small a minority as they are right now? We don't even have to assume that people are getting any sharper at analysis or modeling or stats or anything like that. All it takes, in my opinion, is for the percentage of the betting population that is shopping for the best line and using as many sports books as they can. If that goes from 5% to, let's say, 50%, I think that would be devastating for the margins in the industry as a whole. Now, of course, some companies would fare better in that scenario than others. The sharp books would survive longer than the soft books, because they would at least be moving numbers appropriately, and they would be kind of on the wrong side of it less often than the soft books would be. But nobody is going to be on the wrong side of it, never. Like that's going to happen, and if that happens more and more often, I think the whole model is in jeopardy. These books, like when I listened to your interview with Jeff Davis, it reinforced in my mind how difficult a job that is. Like his job is 100 times more difficult than mine, pricing insurance, because you're not allowed to call from a house that's already on fire and say, I want to buy an insurance policy. You're not allowed to do that, but you can look at the newsreel. Oh, Patrick Mahomes was ruled questionable 4 seconds ago. They're taking more than 4 seconds to move this line. I'm going to jump on it. Or even in game, somebody leaves the game with an injury, and it takes the sports books 25 seconds to update their lines. In that 25 seconds, they can pile up all kinds of liabilities. So the information, the sort of parameters of the risk, at least in insurance, are relatively static over time. But in sports betting, the parameters of the risk can change minute to minute, second to second, and you have to be on top of it every second of every minute of every day. And it was just exhausting, even listening to it. I'm like, how could anyone possibly do this job and do it well? Because it just seems so overwhelmingly hard.
Now you're talking about the ecosystem of sports betting getting smarter, and therefore it becoming harder and harder to bookmake. Is there an evolution that you foresee happening? Is there a solution? Uh, Something's going to have to happen, right? Industries adjust over time.
There is, and there's a couple of different ways that this could go, and I can't tell the future. I don't know what's going to happen. I think that the most obvious consequence would be if you look at the sports betting environment 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I don't think you are going to see the same number of different odds on the screen that you see right now, because this adverse selection problem gets worse and worse the more dispersion there is in number of different providers, number of different odds in the marketplace, because the best out of 20 odds is generally going to be better than the best out of 3 or the best out of 5. So that could look like consolidation, where books merge or buy each other up such that there's just fewer different numbers in the market. It could look like an odds service that multiple books would subscribe to, so that you have 20 different books, but they're all pulling the same one or two different providers for numbers, and so you don't have the same selection problem because everyone's posting the same number. They're just different marketing skins on it. One of the takes that I've been roasted the most for on Twitter is my faith in the parimutuel model as a potential solution to this, because just like in poker, when you're betting against the other players, the house doesn't care how sharp you are, how square you are, what your bankroll is, what your risk tolerance is. They just let you duke it out amongst each other, and they take their cut off the top. So if you imagine what a parimutuel sports book might look like, number one, you don't have to manage risk because you don't have any risk. So this whole problem of having to stay on top of every piece of information every second of the day disappears for you as the provider. With that, the expense of maintaining a trading team disappears, and it becomes a lot simpler from an operator perspective to run the game. Now, it's not perfect. There are downsides with the parimutuel model that would have to be sort of dealt with. As I don't know if you play horses at all, but a common complaint of horse bettors is, when I put my money down, this thing was 8-1, and by the time the horses were out of the gate, it was 4-1. And if I had known it was 4-1, I wouldn't have placed the bet because my fair price is 6-1. Yeah, that can happen in a parimutuel model. You're not getting fixed odds. You don't even know what odds you're getting
So
until it's too late.
explain to me now. A point spread is -8, and sharps love +8, and they line up on +8, and all the squares end up on -8. And how would a book adjust the parimutuel? Would they adjust the line because the money gap could be different? I understand the theoretical concept of how it could work with a money line, but how would it work within a spread?
So there's a bunch of different ways to do this, and I'll just give you one. So you make a spread, say it's eight. Doesn't even have to be kind of right or wrong. It just is what it is. So say the number is eight, and people in the market can take -8 or they can take +8, and you don't care. You're just collecting money on both sides. And at the end of the game, you'll have an outcome. Either the +8 will win or the -8 will win, and you will just divide up the pot amongst whoever picked the winning side. So let's say the true line moved to 5, and you're still sitting at 8, you're going to get more money on +8 than you will on -8. You'll still get some on -8 because the people will see that, okay, the pool is overweighted to the +8, so that the implied odds might be -150 on the +8 and +145 on the -8. So the market efficiency can still hold in a parimutuel system. I think what you'd have to have is really good information. You'd have to have real time updating of how much money is on each side of the pool, and you could even have like separate pools where a common criticism of this is, well, no one's going to bet until 3 seconds before the game, because why would you put your money in with less information? Well, you could have a separate pool running every hour from 24 hours before the game to game time, and each pool will take in money on both sides. It will close, and then the next pool will open, and then each pool will get sort of paid out depending on the money that was in that pool when it closed. So again, I'm spitballing. There's a million different ways that you could do this. The main point is, I think there is more long term sustainability for the industry in a parimutuel model than there is in a fixed odds model, because the um, the ability of bettors to line shop, to get sharper, to whatever, is likely going to outpace the ability of books. It's playing offense versus playing defense. It's always easier to play offense than to play defense, because to play defense, you have to anticipate where the offense is sort of going to come from. Where if you're the offense, you have what's called optionality. You can bet. You want to bet the Broncos, you can bet them at any one of 20 different books, or you can not bet them at all. That's your choice. But they have to offer lines on every game, every market, every day, every sport.
All right, you're a math guy. Give me a percentage of likeliness that we ever see a parimutuel market being the future. And then I
Oh,
also want one for sports exchanges, maybe being the replacement as well.
so parimutuel pools exist. Like even in Ontario, Proline has run for
I'm talking about
decades.
wide scale parimutuel
Yeah,
markets.
wide scale. I mean, could it happen? I would someday love to build one. How much of the market, how much market share will I get? I have no idea if it ever happens. Will it ever become 100% of the market? Unlikely. Um, but I think it has potential to grow when other models might struggle. When you look at the DraftKings and FanDuels of the world, I mean, they're losing money right now because they're blowing so much on marketing. But there's going to have to come a time where they either start to be profitable or their shareholders are going to dump them, and that's going to be a real moment of truth for the sustainability of the industry, when you can't just coast on marketing spend anymore. The industry is mature enough that you have to show your shareholders that you can profit, and then how well is that going to go for them? Nobody knows.
Hey, just want to remind you, the easiest way to improve as a sports bettor is use multiple sports books and always get the best odds. We recommend using an odds comparison tool like BetStamp. BetStamp compares odds across every sports book for games, futures, and player props. Save time and money by checking BetStamp before you bet. Download the app today. If you are looking to sign up for a new sportsbook account, please check out the offers available at betstamp.app/circles off, or hit the link in the description. If you sign up through this page, it really helps support the show. Now back to the rest of the show. I want to talk about, because I promised, I want to talk about let's build a model. And we don't got to go into full scale details, but I want for anybody who's an aspiring modeler who doesn't even know where to begin to have a better sense after listening to this podcast. My first
I'll
question is
try.
my first question is does it start with a theory? You theorize that A could mean more outcomes of B. Is that where you start with your modeling process?
I mean, it could be. For me, the answer tends to be yes, just because I don't have the time or the energy to say, hey, I'm going to originate a WNBA model from scratch. I mean, I could do it if I had unlimited time and data and energy. But a lot of the stuff I do personally tends to concentrate on derivatives, especially correlated parlays. I love correlated parlays, just because they're kind of a smaller box because you can say, well, the market number on the side is this, and I have no reason to disbelieve it. The market number on the total is this, and I have no reason to disbelieve it. So taking those two things as fact, what kind of consequences can I derive from that? So it's less onerous than having to say, well, I know nothing about this game, and I have to price a side or a total from scratch. I mean, again, that's doable, and there are people who originate, major sports out there, and they're very good at it. I'm just not one of them.
All right. We start with a theory. How do you scrape the necessary data to start building this model?
Yeah, I wouldn't say scraping is a great skill of mine. There are people who are just wizards at scraping data from all kinds of places. I tend to just find a publicly available source like I think it's called Sportsbook Reviews Online has a great historical database for all the major sports of lines, spreads, totals, and the outcome of the game. So that's kind of my go to easiest possible spot to get data. But there are others out there. I mean, if I wanted to build a WNBA second half total model, I would just start by Googling, where do I get WNBA second half data, and hopefully something would pop up. But I just kind of see what's out there, and if not, I have a great network of friends, Twitter followers, other bettors, and just try and source that stuff through a network.
All right. You've got your theory, you've got your data. What program are you using to build your model in?
Either Excel or R. So if the number of rows is of a manageable size, let's say 100,000 rows or fewer in my data set, I will tend to go to Excel. I know I get a lot of hate from the data scientist snobs of the world by they say Excel is not a real data science tool. I vehemently disagree with that. There is a ton you can do in Excel that is as good or better than what you can do with R, Python, or anything else. What I love most about Excel is when you have a complex algorithm that has a set of steps in it, you can actually see column by column, step one, step two, step three, rather than them being different blocks of code. So that if something looks weird or there's an error somewhere, it's very easy for me to see where it is rather than having to comment out different sections of code, run only the section, and look at my data set and what's wrong. Debugging is much easier in Excel. Um, if the number of rows is too large to function normally in Excel, I will use R. I just started learning R a couple of years ago during COVID, and I have found it useful, especially for larger data sets. So yeah, Excel or R.
All right, you've got your data, you have your theory, you've put it into a program. It spits out a number. Is that already back tested or do you have to manually back test?
Well, you don't have to do anything, but it's a good idea to backtest any model that you're building. Preferably using something called a holdout sample, where you'll take, let's say, 30% of your data set, randomly select it, put it to the side, don't use it in building your model, and use it for testing at the end. That way, you protect yourself against what's called overfitting, where you just have a model that predicts the past really well, but doesn't predict the future well at all. So when you're backtesting, what you want to see in general for a betting model is a strong correlation between your modeled EV and your backtest ROI. So on bets where I would have given, between 10 and 15% expected value, if I had made those bets, what would my return have been? If it's between 10 and 15%, okay, thumbs up. If it's 5%, then it's like, all right, well, my model's good. I'm picking winners. I'm winning, but it's not perfectly calibrated. So I can either take my numbers and regress them to market, which just shrinks all your edges so that my 10% edge becomes 5%, and there you go. It's calibrated well. Or I can look deeper into my model and see, okay, well, what factor or what combination of factors led me to think I had a 10% edge on this set of games when I really only had a 5% edge, and kind of fix the root of the problem. Either way works.
Now, we you talked about earlier. You alluded to like whenever there's a paradigm shift in sports and the game fundamentally changes. When you're going back and pulling old data, you almost have to make sure that your point of reference is relevant to how the game is played now, right? Whereas it's not skewed by a game that was completely different, maybe even as little as 5 years ago and as much as 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, and even if the game itself hasn't changed, and you're building a model that uses the market number as one of your inputs, which is generally a good idea to do, then your implicit assumption is the market is as sharp now as it was 5 years ago, and it usually isn't. If the market sharpens over time, that would be one thing that would lead you to believe you have an edge that's greater than what you actually do. So you're right. Anything could change, and yeah, you say you have to make sure that nothing changed between your data set and the set of games you're going to be betting into. Okay, well that's great, but what if something did change? What do you do about it? Well, you can just kind of throw your model out and move on to do something else with your life, or you can try and think of what kind of adjustment, what kind of change in method, how you might reframe the problem to minimize the impact of that difficulty. Because if you're having a hard time building a model because teams are shooting more threes than they have before, chances are other people are going to have the same difficulty building their models. So it may actually be an opportunity that if you can find a creative way to overcome that obstacle, you might be able to carve out some space for yourself in the market where you're doing this kind of better than other people are.
How often is with a model are you taking like a subjective approach to tweaking and refining it, and like how often are you doing that?
Yeah, there's no magic answer for that. It depends on your model. It depends on your subject matter. Like you ask yourself, is there any reason why the model I built 3 years ago might not be valid today? And if the answer is yes, it's a good idea to go back and at least run a couple of checks, if not rebuild the entire model. But if you're modeling something like a correlation between two things, where okay, either of the things might change over time, but the correlation should be pretty static, then you can say, okay, this is not something that I have to go back and rebuild every 6 months or every year, because I'm going to get pretty much the same answer as I always got. So it's very domain dependent, very subject matter dependent. And again, it goes back to asking yourself, what are the assumptions, both explicit and implicit, in my model, and how likely is it that they have either become wrong over time or changed over time? And that's the kind of thing that should make you take a second look. I mean, obviously, if your results start to deteriorate as well, that could be just a random run of bad luck, or it could mean that your model is starting to deteriorate, and that's a whole thing in and of itself. And something that I really enjoy as well is what I call small data, where okay, your sample size is too small to be unequivocally relied upon, but it's too big to be completely ignored. And there's a whole world in between ignoring a data set and relying completely on it. And that world is kind of where a lot of the stuff I do lives.
Okay, I love that. I think I have a better understanding of how to build a model, and I hope the listeners do as well. I want to move into a fun aspect of the podcast. Everybody loves a little word association. That's where give you a name, and you tell me with one word or one phrase what you think of that.
Oh, this is
Uh,
going to get me in so much trouble, isn't it?
Oh, I'm intent. This was my intention because you know what? I don't know what it is, but you are one of the few people in gambling Twitter space that are like a magnet for drama. It's unbelievable. I
I
find
try
that
not to be, but
yeah
it happens sometimes. I don't
yeah.
shy away from it when it happens, but I
Oh,
don't.
that's
I
the
don't.
best thing. you're
invited
punchy.
on purpose.
You're punchy. You're willing to take the gloves off and fight.
Yeah, why
Uh,
not?
I've got a couple curveballs and loaded up in the deck here,
Oh
but
boy! All right, let's get to it.
let's go for it. All right, Billy Walters.
Billy Walters, I am looking forward to meeting him at Bet Bash this year. I was super excited to find out he would be coming. I actually don't know all that much about him other than kind of what he's been in the news for, and he's obviously one of the greatest, if not the greatest, sports bettors of all time. I look forward to shaking his hand, taking a selfie with him, whatever they let us do at Bet Bash in August.
Spanky.
Oh, Spanky's I love Spanky. He's great. He and I disagree on a couple of things, but it's always friendly with him. When I first met him in person at Bet Bash last year, he actually lifted me up off the floor, gave me a hug. I have nothing but respect and love for Spanky. He's outspoken, like I am sometimes, but he is someone I like him because he has a very different perspective on things than I do. He and I have very different skill sets, very different strengths, very different weaknesses. But in a lot of ways, it that's kind of the best friend or associate or partner to have is somebody who sort of sees things in a different way and is good at what you're bad at. I'm a huge fan of Spanky.
Simon Hunter.
Simon Hunter. You're gonna have to remind me who he is.
I'm not sure if you know, but he has a really well dominating syndicate that he's a part of. If you're
I'm gonna
unaware,
have to pass on that was this one because I don't even know who he is.
okay, listen. If you don't know who Chris Sky is and Simon Hunter, I'm
Sorry.
all right. Captain Jack.
Captain Jack is awesome. Again, met him for the first time in person at Bet Bash. Had dinner with him, and just the stories that he has. Again, he's been around for a long time. He's done it in the sports betting world. He's done it in the casino AP world. He is just such a wealth of not only knowledge and skills, but great stories. He's the kind of guy I would definitely recommend having a beer with if you can.
How about this guy? He's seems to be a beacon of some controversy. Warren Sharp.
Again, like I know who he is, but I'm not all that familiar with the controversies surrounding him. He's some kind of NFL guy, right? Does he work for teams or consult to teams or something?
He sells picks. He does media. He works for NFL teams.
Yeah, I don't have a much of an opinion of him, good, bad, or otherwise.
All right, Jeff Benson.
Jeff Benson is one guy that I didn't get a chance to meet last year. I hope I get to meet him this year. And again, he and I disagree on a couple of things with regard to the economics of the sportsbook industry and how to run a sportsbook. But he is someone who cares about what he does. And if everyone in the world had the same passion for their job that Jeff Benson has for his, the world would be a much better place.
Steve Fezzik.
Steve Fezzik blocked me on Twitter because I made a comment about RJ Bell and pregame, which I believe he's still involved with. And so, from everything I know about Fezzik, he is a fairly sharp guy, knowledgeable guy. Again, been around forever. I don't know why he's made the decision not only to sell picks, but to associate himself with the goofballs over at pregame.com who have been just exposed every which way, in articles and Twitter and everything. Um, I think he takes a lot of heat. I think he deserves some of it. But if I had the ability he has, I would not have made the career choices that he does. But to each his own. I don't hate him or anything. He just selling picks as a whole is just it's a tough way to make a living, and it's just not something that I would recommend getting involved with.
Haralabab Vulgaris.
Um, he's another one that I'm not so in tune with the controversy of his backstory and was it true, was it false, and again, I'm neutral on him. I think he's a sharp guy. He's done a lot of great things in his life. He's running a soccer team, I think, in Spain now, which is
Yeah.
cool. Like, go do your thing, make your money, follow your dreams. I don't have a strong positive or negative opinion on him.
Last one, Joey Knish.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Diggs.
No, I don't want to be the wrath of Diggs Fury right now. Let's avoid that for a while. I don't think he's clued into a new 90 degrees host,
Oh
and
boy.
I don't want to get put into the flamethrower.
Joey Knish, he's a funny guy. He's an entertainer. Like, I'm not sure how. Like, I think he probably makes money at this. I'm not sure exactly how. He tries to be funny. Sometimes he succeeds. Sometimes he doesn't. He's had some interactions with some friends of mine that have been less than great. I'm not going to get into that. I'll leave it at that. But at the end of the day, he's a guy trying to build a following by being entertaining on the internet, and that is what it is.
All right, I don't think I got you into too much trouble, but if this episode drops on Monday and Tuesday I see you in a bunch of Twitter fights, I'm gonna apologize to you for getting you under the heat right here.
That won't necessarily be your fault or anything to do with this if that happens. It's just a regular Monday for me.
Awesome. Plus EV Analytics, I want to thank you for doing this. I know I've reached out to you and I wanted to do this interview for a while, and I do appreciate your time tonight.
That's been great. Thanks a lot, George, for having me.
Hey, that's it for me. Another edition of 90 Degrees is in the books. I want to thank my guests, Plus EV Analytics, actuary, gambler, instructor of the art of sports betting analytics. I want to thank the sponsors of this podcast, Pinnacle and BetStamp, and my producer, Jason Cooper. Thanks for listening. Do me a favor before you go, like the content, subscribe, share, and comment. We'll be back next week with another guest on the 90 Degrees podcast, where we give an inside look into the sports betting industry. That's it for me. Hope you enjoyed. Until next time.